Hello, Abby, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a 23-year-old medical student at Bristol University, and honesty is an intrinsic part to my current and future professional practice. The GMC regards dishonesty in any form as an extreme case of misconduct, and it requires a fitness to practice review. As politicians are responsible for so many lives as well, should they be held to the same standards?
Wonderful. Who would like to answer that? I have to say that Compassion in Politics launched a petition on this issue, and we got over 200,000 signatures in favour of a law to prevent inaccurate statements being made in politics. Michael?
I wrote I won't call it an essay, a diatribe in The Lancet a couple of years ago after the Brexit vote and Donald Trump's election. And I asked, what's the worst sin a scientist can commit qua science? And the answer is lying. The worst thing a scientist can do is to lie. And the worst thing a doctor could do would be to lie. If you got breast cancer and you go to your doctor and your doctor says, take this drug, it'll reduce your chance of recurrence, you're entitled to trust her that she is telling you the truth. If she's making it up, the whole thing collapses. And rightly, I then pointed out the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index. Number one, trusted by 93% of the population, nurses. They're our real heroes. Our underpaid, undervalued nurses, trusted by 93%. Then doctors, and then judges, scientists, teachers, all do pretty well. You get no prize for guessing who brings up the rear. Politicians generally, trusted by 14%, government ministers by 20%, just below journalists, who in turn are just below estate agents. So the doctors and nurses have earned our trust, and the politicians have earned our mistrust. It's a terrible state of affairs, absolutely terrible state of affairs. I think we could revolutionize our politics overnight if we had a different standard of respect for the truth.
I think the answer is that politicians should be held to a higher standard, but they're not. Long-running political theory, going back to Cicero and On the Consulship, says one of the best political strategies is just promise everything before the election, get elected, and then do something different. But the question is, well, how do you make politicians act honestly? And I think that depends on the media and the media's regulation. We have a massive problem with fake news. And we have the biggest media organization in the world, which is Facebook, refuses to take down misleading or even lying advertisements. So one of the things that we could do is we could say that Ofcom in the UK under the Communications Act has to regulate the internet in the same way that television broadcasts or radio broadcasts are regulated. And we probably also need to do something about media ownership, because it's unsustainable to have the biggest newspapers in the countries owned by the people who run Barclays Bank, who run Fox News, and so on and so on.
And I think one of the things the crisis has done is made clear that the issues are not health versus the climate, or indeed the lives versus jobs. But these things are all interrelated, and we have a set of tools that we know can work around subsidies, around taxes, around regulation. We need to be using those. We need to be using them smartly. And we also need to be aware that lobbying does go on. We perhaps are less open to lobbying in the UK than perhaps in the US, where you can see really dire effects from lobbying. But we need to be aware of that when we think about dividing smart policies. And the other thing we need to be aware of is that people make behavioural changes in response to policy.
I was really struck. I'm not a regular reader of the Financial Times. It's not aimed at me. But when Martin Wolf, the chief economic correspondent of the Financial Times, says capitalism is rigged, what we have is rentier capitalism. But Martin Wolf says rent is paying more than you need to guarantee the necessary supply of labour, goods and services. And he says that rentier capitalism is controlled by an elite for their profit and extracting rent from the large mass of the population. Now let's turn to our nurses and care workers. When a care worker is paid less than the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. So that was one of my major recommendations in the Marmot Review and the 10 Years On Review. You can calculate the living wage, what the minimum income is for a healthy life. And if a care worker and some of our nurses are not paid enough money to lead a healthy life, there's something really, really, really wrong. That's rentier capitalism that's damaging the very fabric of our society. We now recognize that we need those supermarket checkout people. They're absolutely vital. We need the delivery people. We need our nurses and our care workers. They're a vital part of our society. And we don't pay them appropriately. We allow rich people to get away with everything. We allow tax dodgers on a grand scale. I did a calculation during the Brexit campaign that the amount of money that was avoided by tax avoidance by multinationals was pretty close to that £300 million a week lie on the side of the bus. If you actually stop tax avoidance by multinationals, you could well put extra money into the NHS. But we need a total rethink about how we value the people who make this fundamental contribution to our well-being.
Thank you. We've just got time for one more question, and I've been asked to read it out. He says, I've been attending the UN climate conference for 20 years. Each one sees countries pledging to cut emissions. When I went to my first such meeting, annual greenhouse gas emissions were 37 billion tonnes of CO2. Now they're about 55 billion tonnes and still rising. The world's populations and economies are growing too and driving emissions ever higher. The UK's emissions from all sources, including imports, have remained steady at just under 1 billion tonnes a year. The pandemic is a relatively short blip on these inexorable long-term trends. So why do you expect it to make any impact at all in changing them?
I wouldn't expect the pandemic to make a change, but collective will can do it. And the reason, and I think that the question's premise is absolutely right. You know, we've had all these summits and it's not been working. It's failed since Kyoto and right up to Paris. And that's because we've got it upside down. We've got pledges to cut emissions or cease emissions by some long distant date in the future. What we need to be doing is turn that logic on its head and say we need to ban carbon now, subject to limited exceptions based on technological necessity. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, so for people who are in my age group or younger, the students that I teach, we are going to be facing a catastrophic crisis. And I don't agree that this is a slow burn crisis. This is going to be a series of really serious impacts, from bushfires in Australia to floods in the UK to hurricanes in America. And it's going to be really, really bad unless we get a shift in mindset. And that means stopping all carbon right now as fast as technologically possible. And that's why I think things like a Green New Deal, things like making sure that all of the 640 billion that the government promises to spend over this parliament goes towards getting zero carbon technology, banning fossil fuels from every aspect of our economy, energy generation and transport in particular.
Thank you. George?
I think, Steve, there is a realization during this lockdown that there is a better, that there is the chance of a better world out there. I attended the Paris COP in the end of 2016, and I'm absolutely sure that while things have not got better, they would have got a good deal worse if we hadn't been going through that whole process with every country in the world. And so I think we built a base from which we can make a make a real inroad into the climate threat. So I'm an optimist that when we come out of this, that there will be a push from the general public towards a greater priority for the whole climate change issue.